All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today, sticking around the afternoon for this great panel. We have some really wonderful panelists to talk about a new law from the United States called the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act. My name is Scott Graytak. I'm the Advocacy Director for Transparency International US. To my left is Steve Young. He is a Special Supervisory Agent with the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigations, the FBI. To his left is France Chain, a Senior Legal Analyst at the OECD's Anti-Corruption Division. To her left is Alex Gillies. She's the Director of the Global Anti-Corruption Consortium at the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, or OCCRP. To Alex's left is Michelle Crimes. She's the Deputy Director of the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center at the Center for International Private Enterprise. To her left is Al Musa, the Head of Transparency International Nigeria. And last but not least is Amanda Strayer. She is Senior Counsel for Accountability at Human Rights First. So we are here because according to Transparency International's last Corruption Perceptions Index, over 120 countries have serious corruption risks. For the longest time, this has resulted in attempts to crack down on iterations of corruption like foreign bribery that involve not only a bribe giver, but a bribe receiver. Late last year, the United States became the first country in the world to pass a version of a foreign bribery law that will go after the demand side of bribery. This law is known as the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, or FEPA, as we will be referring to it today. And it basically says that if any employee or agent of a foreign government, whether that's on the national level, the state level, or a local level, or any former or current senior level official of that government, or an immediate family member or associate of that person, so very broad, asks for or receives a bribe in exchange for an official act or other benefit on behalf of the government, that person, that foreign official, can now be subject to extraterritorial jurisdiction from the U.S. government and can face up to 15 years in prison or a $250,000 fine, so criminal penalties for that. Again, this is the first in the world to have this sort of sanction, associated penalty, and so we're here to unpack it. We've got great perspectives from civil society, law enforcement, governments, and we want to encourage some conversation, given the relative size of the audience here today. So we're going to kick off with 5 minutes from each panelist who's going to give their opening remarks. I'll do a little bit of moderated discussion, but then let's really try and open things up for a Q&A. We'll have a mic circulating, and we can get into some questions. So without further ado, Steve, if you could kick us off.
Sure. So again, Steve Young. I'm a supervisory special agent with the International Corruption Unit within the FBI. First, I just want to say thanks to Scott and Transparency International for inviting us to participate here today, and thanks to all of you for kind of sticking things out to the bitter end and showing up here at 3:30 on a Friday. So the International Corruption Unit is the FBI component that has the responsibility for conducting FCPA investigations, so Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which I'm assuming probably most of you are familiar with. FCPA was established in the United States back in the 70s, but really enforcement, even for us, kind of took a while to pick up. And I think especially in the last maybe 10 to 15 years, there's been a really drastic increase in FCPA enforcement in the United States. And that's our primary tool for addressing foreign bribery in the U.S. Of course, and I won't get too bogged down into the various elements of FCPA, but the one limitation was, that was the tool for going after the bribers, right? So the U.S. entity that we had jurisdiction over that was bribing foreign officials, when we worked the FCPA case, that was targeting the briber and not typically never directly addressing the public official in the other jurisdiction. We could and would get creative in trying to find other violations potentially that we could address at the same time that might loop that official into some sort of conspiracy, so maybe money laundering or wire fraud or something of that nature. But there was nothing that directly allowed us to address that public official under FCPA. And certainly, in an ideal situation, we could be working with other law enforcement partners in that jurisdiction, and they would ideally have a domestic corruption case on that official. But, as we're all aware, depending on the location, that was much more or less likely. And then, as Scott mentioned now, we have this new tool as of this year, FIPA, and it's going to be really interesting to see, as that we start getting and identifying cases that we can utilize that without having to get so creative, just directly address that demand side of the foreign bribery spectrum. Again, as these cases unfold, I suspect it's going to be a situation where enforcement of FIPA is going to also be pretty dependent on the kind of cooperation we can get from our partners. So it's still going to involve, a lot of international collaboration. The advantage of FCPA, and it's also going to apply to FIPA, is the situations it applies to, the jurisdictional reach is pretty broad, and going to be very curious to see as we start implementing it, how that unfolds, and we start opening FIPA cases on officials in other countries that are either receiving or demanding bribes from U.S. companies. I think that's enough. I'll turn it over to you.
And just to make the point clear, so the way that FIPA works, it's U.S. companies, it's U.S. persons, U.S. citizens, but it's any company that's listed on a U.S. stock exchange, so on the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange, which is hundreds, thousands of companies from around the world. Okay.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I kind of hinted at that a little bit just to expand on it. For FCPA, and it's going to be the same under FIPA, and as you mentioned, obviously U.S. companies, but foreign companies that are traded on the U.S. Stock Exchange, foreign, an entirely foreign entity, but let's say some component of the, some overt act in support of the bribery took place in, like in the United States, again, like a very broad definition of terms when it comes to like U.S. entity and things that would give the United States jurisdiction. So I think it's going to be a powerful tool.
Great. Let's go to France, if you would.
Hello, everyone. Again, thank you for being here this afternoon. So I'm from the OECD Anti-Corruption Division. I'm not American in spite of the accent, since we do have quite a few of fellow Americans around. This year is the 25th anniversary of the entry into force of the Anti-Bribery Convention, which is what my colleagues and I work on. And when it was adopted at the time, the idea was specifically that the supply side of foreign bribery was not being covered, that a lot of companies were engaging in corruption of foreign public officials and that our countries, our rich people's countries, were not taking responsibility for it in the fight against corruption. And not only was it allowed, but it was tax deductible in a number of countries back then. The convention came into force. It has a very strong peer review system, which has led to a lot of changes in legislation, not only on criminalization of foreign bribery, but on legal persons, accounting, et cetera, et cetera. But for years, of course, the private sector has been pressing us at the OECD and member countries to address the demand side, because they are being investigated and prosecuted, and they kind of felt it was unbalanced. And honestly, 10 years back, or in 2009, when we negotiated our anti-bribery recommendation, which complements the convention, they didn't have much echo among the governments, which were like, yes, sure, of course, for practical reasons that it's difficult to get to the foreign public officials, but also because that was not the point of the convention. So it's interesting that in 2021, when we concluded with our 46 member countries our negotiations on the anti-bribery recommendation, there is now a section on addressing the demand side. Now, the focus of the convention and the recommendation remains the supply side of foreign bribery. The idea is not to go monitor what happens on the flip side, as we call it, and we'll get back maybe later to some of the findings in that study we did 6 years ago. But the idea is to encourage better prevention, but also better international cooperation among our countries, because in the study I just referred to from 6 years ago, what we found out was that there were very few foreign bribery cases where the flip side, where the foreign public official had been investigated, even less where the foreign public official had been sanctioned, and where there were investigations where there were sanctions, the detection source was mostly the media, very, very rarely international cooperation. So just all of that to explain that the new standards on addressing the demand side focus very much on international cooperation, on prevention, and on providing support to companies when they are being solicited for bribes. The way we do this very briefly at the OECD is, as I mentioned, through peer pressure, through monitoring, and through ensuring that our countries effectively implement the provisions in these instruments. It's a very rigorous mechanism that countries have to go through and don't always like, but it has been proven somewhat efficient in major changes in the law, like the Loi Sapin II or the UK Bribery Act or the corporate liability in Colombia, for instance. So I'll leave it at that for now.
So the OECD, as you alluded to, did a study. Was this 8 years ago?
2018.
Can you say more briefly about that? I think that tees it up very nicely.
Sure. So indeed, the idea was that, again, it came from we work closely with the private sector for obvious reasons, and there was a strong push, including by the OECD Business and Industry Advisory Committee, to look at what was being done on the other side. So what we did is we took all the foreign bribery cases that we had, and I won't lie, the large majority were American ones, probably still are even today, and we tried to follow back to the foreign public official and see and how often the foreign public official had been investigated and sanctioned. And honestly, the figures, it was only in 1/5 of the, at the time, 55 concluded foreign bribery cases that sanctions had been imposed against one or more public officials. So very, very low. There were more investigations, of course, and so, it was issues of resources and capacity. There were issues of statute of limitations cases becoming time barred. It was, so the machinery of justice being sometimes very slow, and then issues of evidence, which again is also touches, I think, on international cooperation aspects, because presumably if the supply side was able to be sanctioned, then one could assume that with better cooperation, it would make it easier for both sides to enforce. Although you would know more about that, Steve. But so that's what the study found out in very broad terms.
Very helpful. Okay, terrific. Alex, so much of OCCRP's reporting focuses on foreign bribery, so many powerful examples that have been uncovered by folks at the organization. I know in particular some recent reporting on Malta. If you could help us connect those dots about how the media plays an essential role in surfacing these instances.
Great. Thanks, Scott, and really happy to be here. So I work for OCCRP, which is a global network of investigative journalists, and as you say, from time to time, the reporting does cover transactions or deals which turn out to be bribery. And I do want to mention one example just to kind of bring to life this challenge a little bit. It's easy to kind of get into the technicalities of legal tools, but this is a major corruption challenge that, when it's allowed to move forward, has serious impacts on the lives of everyday people. Last month, the former Prime Minister of Malta, Joseph Muscat, and a number of other top officials were formally charged with bribery and related offenses. In the case, the Maltese prosecutors accuse a healthcare company called Steward and its US-based executives of taking part in these transactions. This company in 2018 had taken over a large government contract to manage 3 public hospitals. And prosecutors have said the company participated in the bribery scheme, diverting millions of dollars to a consulting firm instead of using those funds to improve Maltese hospitals. On Monday, so just this week, OCCRP and its partners at the Boston Globe and the Times of Malta published a story that was based on emails that provide new information about these transactions. And basically they show how Steward, the healthcare company's most senior executives, signed off on payments to this intermediary firm that is suspected of bribing the former foreign minister. Now, this is an open case. The officials have been charged, but they have not yet been convicted. Steward, the company, and its executives have been implicated in the proceedings. They have not been charged with any crimes, and all the parties I've mentioned have said that they're innocent of this. But I think the situation still brings to life how seriously we need to take foreign bribery concerns and how additional tools to address it are really welcome. In Malta, around this case, protesters have taken to the streets on numerous occasions out of frustration with the corruption, but also the state of these hospitals that were supposed to be managed by this firm. And this is in a country where it came out in Parliament last month that the current waiting list for MRI scans is 16,000 people long. And the concerns with Steward, this company, don't stop in Malta. In the US, they've declared bankruptcy in a financial meltdown that's put the health of 8 US hospitals at risk as well. So just a quick story to kind of add some specificity to the challenge.
Much appreciated. And obviously, under the FCPA, officers of American companies can be held criminally liable for those bribe offerings. Michelle, the history of FIPA's enactment was really an incredible cross-partisan opportunity in the United States. It's not often that we see Republicans and Democrats agreeing on something of such substance. I'm reminded that the House of Representatives passed 26 bills last year. We're lucky that FIPA was included in one of them. But this was really an interesting marriage of private sector support with organizations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, with organizations like Greenpeace, obviously Transparency International, a really incredible and ideologically inclusive coalition of folks who came behind this. Curious from your vantage point at SIPE, with all of the good work that you do, businesses on the ground who may find themselves in high risk of corruption environments, what FIPA may mean for those efforts going forward and how you see this new law.
Yeah, so I've given a lot of thought about this, and I think one of the things I'd like to do is explain a little bit, SIPE, what we do. So Center for International Private Enterprise and my team in particular, we focus on private sector integrity initiatives. It's just a small bit of what we do, but it's the part that's most relevant to what we're talking about here. And we sit in this really interesting space between economic development and democracy. So we've got a foot in both of these worlds, right? And most of what we do is bringing the private sector into these types of conversations. So I think yesterday there was a lot of talk about the private sector. What is the private sector doing? How does the private sector understand these integrity initiatives? And so the private sector is smack dab in the center of this particular conversation. I think it's a really fantastic and wonderful thing from my perspective and the work that I do, working in particularly with MSMEs, so micro, small, and medium entrepreneurs. I really think this gives them a tool. A lot of times what happens in the case of being asked to pay a bribe, being solicited, sometimes small business owners, medium business size owners, they don't feel like they have a choice. They need to, I think, to get to your point, to make it real, they need to make a living. They have bills to pay. They're contributing to their community. And so a lot of times what can happen is, while you may not be inherently a corrupt person, you might engage in a corrupt act because you've got to continue to sort of be realistic and live in your environment. I see FIPA as a really interesting opportunity to push back and say, well, I can't do that, which may not be so convincing, but now it's you can't do that. And so it's a fantastic way for the private sector to be able to push back, and I think it's going to be potentially a really powerful tool as well for CSOs that sort of work in this space too around business integrity to sort of know what's going on and have transparency. It's a really exciting time, so yeah.
Thank you so much, Michelle. We were really happy to have TI Nigeria's support for this law. Transparency International, we received testimonials from about a dozen of our chapters around the world who talked about the difficulty of working with local officials, in their home countries who were soliciting and accepting bribes from foreign companies, and the ways that endangered so many of the issues that they cared about and worked on. Can you tell us a bit about the experience TI Nigeria has had with foreign bribery, and how you and the chapter came to see a law like FIPA?
Thank you very much. Let me also join other speakers to thank the organizers. But I also want to thank the United States government for coming up with this legal framework, which actually brings hope and confidence that administrative justice system, can once again bounce back if there's a collective action. In Nigeria and many countries in Africa, justice is simply for sale. The administrative justice system appears to be very weak, ineffective, and inefficient, and is completely compromised by political class, especially the politically exposed person. As I speak to you, many Nigerians have lost confidence in, judiciary, because once you don't have money or you are not connected with the power or you do not have a foreign, ally, you cannot simply get justice. So many cases of corruption are not even be looked upon, despite the effort of the anti-corruption institutions in Nigeria that are doing very good work. They are also being undermined, and there's a direct interference. So, multinational companies that come to bribe officials are having their way without any check. But with this new legal framework, which I believe we should, internationalize, adoption and domestication of this law will help to compel, public officials in my country and in many countries in Africa to actually ensure that there's a consequences for promoting and tolerating foreign bribery. Because right now, it is completely silent, and people get away with that. And that is why notorious companies, when they come to do business in Nigeria, they get away, they bribe the official. In fact, officials demand bribe, from them. And we all know the role of Clan and Brown, companies, and the role that Glanco also company played in Nigeria. So we need an instrument like the one that United States has now to at least instill fear and remind both sides, the demand side and the other side, to say that if you do offer bribe, there's a consequences to that. It should not be like a passion for you to come and bribe or demand bribe. There should be sanction, tangible sanction against anybody who will demand bribe. And that's the only way we can actually begin to restore even business environment where companies can actually even go and do business without being extorted, without actually going into corruption, either to give the bribe or for the official politically exposed person in the country to be demanding for bribe. Because there's a consequences to collecting bribe, to abandon, merit, or to undermine even what the project should be. So we believe that this instrument should not only be left like this. There should be actually a step to move forward to ensure that United States government actually do enter into mature legal assistance with countries like my country to say that, look, if there's a case like this, we should actually have the legal jurisdiction to prosecute your official. It's not enough just to punish the company that are listed in the stock exchange or that are registered in the United States, but they should actually have repercussion for those ones that are demanding bribe in the country. I think this will go away. It will go a long way in terms of bringing some level of sanity and ensuring that we reduce the effect of foreign bribery in our country.
Thanks, Rafsanjani. Well said. Amanda, Human Rights First, one of our good partners, has developed a pipeline program for the United States' leading anti-corruption sanctions program, the Global Magnitsky Act, or GLOMAG as we call it. Very successful program that is able to identify and investigate and build a body of evidence for what may substantiate a GLOMAG sanctioning by the U.S. government. There are a lot of stakeholders now for FIPA who are interested in building a similar pipeline so that we can really put this law to use and make sure that it has the positive impact that we all hoped it would. Can you speak to that from your perch at Human Rights First, how you've looked at GLOMAG and some parallels that you see for FIPA?
Sure, yeah, and thank you again, Scott, and Transparency International for having us here today and for hosting this event, and thank you all for sticking around for the Friday afternoon. And as you noted, a lot of my focus at Human Rights First is on other types of accountability tools than we've been talking about, primarily the Global Magnitsky Sanctions Program. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, it's a sanctions program that the US government has to target individuals and entities involved in corruption and involved in serious human rights abuses around the world. So in my work at Human Rights First, I help coordinate a global coalition of more than 300 civil society organizations that are doing advocacy with the US government and other governments that have very similar sanctions tools like the UK, Canada, EU, Australia, to encourage them to be using information from civil society to sanction perpetrators of corruption and human rights abuses. A huge part of the Global Magnitsky Sanctions Program to date has focused on corruption. Of the 553 designations under the program at the moment, 393 have focused on corruption or individuals and entities involved in both corruption and human rights abuses. And within that scope, a significant part of those cases have focused on bribery involving foreign officials and private sector actors. We did some research at Human Rights First in 2022 and found that more than 2/3 of the corruption sanctions under that program mentioned or referred to acts of bribery as part of the basis for sanctioning these individuals. So it was the most commonly cited form of corruption that we've seen under the program, which tells us not only is bribery a huge part of the Global Magnitsky sanctions story, but bribery is integral, I think, to how so many other forms of corruption are being carried out. And so much of it feeds so many other forms of corruption that we see around the world today. Some of the cases that Global Magnitsky has been used to sanction, I think, can start to overlap somewhat with what we're going to see in the FIPA cases world. We've seen sanctions against Serbian arms dealers, Tesik. We've seen sanctions against Latvian oligarchs, Ivar Lembergs, who was then later convicted of bribery and spent some time in prison. We've seen sanctions targeting abusive actors engaged in environmental crimes and deforestation, folks that were paying bribes to government officials to ensure that the international community wasn't notified about his illegal timber logging businesses. We've also seen many of these cases that have really strong U.S. nexus and ties. Just earlier this month, we saw sanctions against several individuals in Guyana who were former ExxonMobil contractors who were implicated in bribery and tax fraud schemes in Guyana. And last year, we saw in December sanctions against the Rahmanis in Afghanistan for a complex procurement corruption scheme that resulted in misappropriating millions of dollars from U.S. government-funded contracts that were meant to support Afghan security forces. And then that wealth that they accumulated was later used to bribe voters, members of the Afghan Independent Election Commission, even to pay members of parliament to secure a speakership in parliament. So I guess what does all this sanctions connection have to do with FIPA? I think sanctions could play a really interesting role in FIPA and civil society engagement as well. The ultimate goal of our work is to increase opportunities for accountability for corrupt actors and human rights abusers, which is why we were so excited to see FIPA's passage, because it helps enhance the ability to pursue some of this accountability and to bring some criminal penalties and fines for individuals involved in those abuses. But I think rather than seeing these tools as mutually exclusive, there's a potential for some interesting complementary strategic uses of these tools by the U.S. government to more effectively fight corruption. I'm thinking, for example, of cases where you have foreign officials demanding, accepting bribes from U.S. companies or NASDAQ-registered companies, as we've been discussing. You could envision potentially one strategy of the U.S. government using sanctions first to target that foreign individual actor, part of the benefit of sanctions is there's a lower evidentiary threshold than there are for criminal prosecution. So as you're working to build a body of evidence, sanctions might be a first stop along the path to that. Those sanctions would freeze any assets that individual may have in the U.S. or in U.S. jurisdiction, and then you could see later follow-up action from U.S. law enforcement through new FIPA actions that may also bring additional criminal penalties and perhaps additional civil forfeiture initiatives that could be developed. So I think in all of this, civil society has been really crucial to providing information to the U.S. government as a pipeline for potential targets for Magnitsky sanctions. And I think looking at models like that, where perhaps U.S. law enforcement cooperation with the Treasury and State Departments that are looking at these types of cases and trying to figure out the best strategic approach to move forward with addressing particular instances of corruption, and looking at civil society, looking at reporting from the media or journalists as also additional opportunities to engage with new types of sources that could help strengthen the enforcement of these tools.
So much to unpack there. Thanks, Amanda. And it strikes me as we have this conversation, just the perspectives that we have on this stage is pretty remarkable. To have the private sector, law enforcement, media, civil society, government, just the range of good that can be done, and the reason that there is this much diversity of support for these kind of laws. For folks who came in late, we're talking about the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act. It's a new law approved by the U.S. government this last December that gives our Justice Department the ability to go after any foreign official, which is any employee of a foreign government, who asks for or accepts a bribe from an American company, or any company listed on a U.S. stock exchange, or from anybody if it takes place inside the United States. We're going to go to Q&A in a few minutes here, but until we do, I have some directed questions for our panel. And the first one I have is, why, France talked about a 20% domestic enforcement rate in countries where the official has taken a bribe. What are the barriers here? Why do we have so little enforcement in the countries where their foreign officials are soliciting and accepting bribes? A lot of perspectives, but what's the obstacle to creating the record here? What's the obstacle to bringing cases, to building the evidence, to getting sanctions? Open question. Go for it.
Okay, I think one of the reasons is simply because there's no political will from the leaders. Where a situation whereby leaders now in most places, especially in Africa, they purchase election, they purchase appointment, they determine who becomes the judge, they actually purchase judgment. Definitely you will not see any improvement in terms of dealing with that. Secondly, the shrinking of civil space is also affecting the advocacy of civil society organizations to demand for accountability and ensure that those who are involved in bribery scandal are actually punished. Because even if they raise the issue, there will be crackdown, there will be blackmail, and even the anti-corruption institutions themselves, they face serious threat, from even the same government that actually appointed them. So there are a number of obstacles, that are undermining effectiveness of dealing with bribery, whether local or foreign bribery, it's almost the same thing, because once the administrative justice system is for sale, you can bribe, you can get away with it, and the repercussion is, of course, under development, because these are resources that are meant to cater for health, education, even security and infrastructure. And as a result of bribery, you compromise all those things, and therefore people are at the receiving end of this. So I think those are the combination. But I think in the case of Africa and Nigeria in particular, civil society are working day and night to ensure that they demand for accountability and they raise these issues. And all that we want is this kind of global solidarity, global support to ensure that when there are cases like that involve, the foreign national, they should actually not spare them, and they should also demand that same punishment is also carried out at in-country level. I think with that, we can be able to minimize the effects and the escalation as well as the impunity in the foreign bribery that is going on, globally. Thank you.
Amen to that. Who else has thoughts?
I mean,
Go for it. Then France.
Essentially, yeah, I would second everything that was just said. I mean, oftentimes what we see is either, the corruption involves either directly the politicians or a party or government that's still in power and therefore, obviously are not going to support investigations into themselves, or they just see it in their best interest to keep, investigative or prosecutive entities, to not empower them just because they see potential future exposure, even if it's not related to that particular situation or that particular case. It's in their interest to sort of keep those, to limit their vulnerability in the future for other separate activity. So,
yep, France.
Probably really to reinforce what was said. I mean, it's an issue of the foreign public officials still being in power and therefore not being prosecuted. Sometimes it happens that after they've left power, but then we've got destruction of evidence, or cases becoming statute barred because they're too old, or the opposition takes power, the investigations start, and then the claim is that this is just payback, which goes way beyond the legal framework. But what you were saying is what it boils down to is it is a lot about independence and autonomy of law enforcement, because if the public officials aren't being prosecuted while they're in power, it's because the executive has power over the judiciary, and that in itself is an issue. And by the way, if you bribe me, I'm also covered now under FIPA because it's also officials of public international organizations.
You heard it here first.
So yeah, well, just so you know.
Yeah, we'll get to that in Q&A. Go for it,
Can I
Michelle.
just add one thing? So I think there's also a lot of sort of opaqueness around what's happening, right, in sense of the private sector. Someone asked you for a bribe. I think it was in a session yesterday. It was like, who are you going to call? Which, as a kid from the 80s, Ghostbusters reference was really great. But I think now that's where we're seeing a bit of a shift. What are you going to do if you're, again, mom and pop shop, someone asks you for a bribe? Who are you going to tell? What are you going to do? And so I think there's also that side of it. Maybe you have a CSO, that's society that's, vibrant and operating. Maybe there are reporters you can go to, but there's so many obstacles to prevent people from reporting and to having a place to go. So I think there's an interesting shift that could potentially happen here.
Let me ask this. The number one question that I know we get about FIPA, it's all about practicality. A lot of ways to unpack this. The U.S. has passed a law. Let's be honest. The U.S. passed the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the late 70s. That law mostly lay dormant for its first couple of decades, maybe longer. We know that it's going to take, you mentioned political will, the will of this community to make FIPA more than words on paper. But what are we really talking about? What are the barriers to the U.S. government actually having they have the legal authority, but the practical ability to go after foreign officials? What is this going to look like in practice? Big question, but somebody give me an idea of how this could work.
I'll say something. Well,
Alex,
I don't know about how it will work, but a few words on the challenges, because I think in some ways it's the same challenges that journalists face in reporting on bribery. Bribery in particular, it's a lot easier to write kind of a descriptive story about how a system of kleptocracy might function. But when you have to trace specific payments from one party to another, I mean, even in the Malta example that I gave, the case laid out by the prosecution, it's not the most complicated bribery allegations I've ever seen, but still, you do have an intermediary involved. So you have a company making payments to an intermediary making payments to a public official. So you have to those funds could be fungible, they're timeline issues, and so making the case, the same way it's difficult to bring cases against companies, those difficulties aren't going to go away just because you're going after the public officials. And I think we can look around and see evidence of how hard it's going to be, and I'd love to hear some of your ideas about strategies, but before OCCRP, I worked on oil corruption for many years, including in Nigeria, where Rafsanjani and I used to hang out in his office in Abuja. In 2010 to 2015 was a period of historic oil sector corruption in Nigeria. And I think there's wide agreement among authorities around the world, including in Nigeria, that the former oil minister was a major part of that. She, after leaving power in 2015, went to London. She was first detained by UK authorities in 2015. She has been charged for receiving a bribe of £100,000. And her trial was recently started and then deferred to 2025. So that's a 10-year period in which UK authorities have been trying to go after an official who, according to Nigerian authorities, was involved in $2.5 billion worth of corruption. And so I think that gives a sense of, how important this is. Like, this was corruption that crippled the Nigerian economy during a time of high oil prices. They could have been saving money paying for the poverty reduction, the energy transition, et cetera, et cetera. That opportunity was wasted because of corruption. That's pretty widely established, and yet still bringing cases against one of the central officials has proven really difficult. So I hope it can work, because it's so important, but it won't be easy.
Yeah, jump in here, Steve.
I mean, I would just say that a real challenge is going to be, just like I was mentioning earlier, we always, under FCPA, would hope that the official that we're investigating that was receiving the bribes, that the country in question would be cooperating and they would have their own domestic corruption investigation into that official. And I would have to imagine that in many of these cases where if we're having difficulties on that end with cooperation with our foreign counterparts, those are probably going to be countries where we're going to have a difficult time getting cooperation on a FIPA case. And so, the collection of the evidence necessary on the official could be a challenge. I mean, will be a challenge, I'm sure. We have an advantage when it comes to the U.S. entity because we have subpoena power over them. We can compel them to provide documents and records and access to employees for interviews and proffers. That's going to be a lot trickier when it comes to obtaining the equivalent information in that jurisdiction. Now, obviously, we're going to get some of that information in investigating the company for the U.S. entity, but there's frequently situations where there's going to be some things. There might be some. An advantage of the sanctions is that even though there are certainly requirements and standards that have to be met, it's not a criminal process, and the standards are not as stringent. You don't have that beyond a reasonable doubt, and where you have to really to the same degree back up every single component and element of the crime. So that's,
So let's just go there. Yeah, and Amanda.
I was going to just jump in real quick, because I think exactly what Alex was saying about the difficulties that civil society or investigative journalists face in terms of being able to track to a level of granularity that you would need in order to be able to bring these kind of cases. I work with civil society groups all the time that are facing these exact same challenges on the global Magnitsky front. And even though the evidentiary standards are lower, you still, if you want to sanction someone for bribery, you have to prove there was a bribe paid or received somewhere. And I think one of the things that we've really learned in the global Magnitsky space is that thinking about broadening your information network and your sources network is really, really key. And it is a part of successfully doing that is doing a lot of outreach and a lot of awareness raising and a lot of helping people understand what does this law cover, how can it be used, how can we deploy it most effectively, because then that will bring in more interested persons and information, especially in contexts where we're talking about where the government, where this corruption is occurring, is probably going to do everything that they can to hide that information and to not cooperate. And if you have places where there is a strong, vibrant civil society that's very focused on trying to do their best to investigate these situations, it really helps for them to know that this, what is the pathway for sharing that information, or where can it be useful? And so I think as much as possible for the U.S. or other governments that have similar style programs or laws to go after this type of bribery, it can be really helpful to do that sort of outreach more with key civil society organizations. So that way, if they do come across information, they're interested in sharing it, they know what they need to find and who to send it to, which sounds pretty basic, but it can be a huge information gap sometimes.
Let me press us on this a little bit, though, if I could. So with Global Magnitsky, even though the evidentiary threshold is lower, even in situations where you provide, like Alex is saying, clear evidence that threshold has been met, there's a political component in here. I imagine with the FCPA, if a certain evidentiary threshold is met, prosecutors bring the case. What's going to happen in these situations where you have the political dynamic involved, where maybe a country that is allied with the United States, or a country that has a very difficult political reality where we don't feel comfortable attempting to indict and charge a foreign official? How is this going to play out in practice given that political quotient?
I mean, from my perspective and experience from the FBI, from an investigative perspective, and really for Department of Justice, the political component should not really come into our, that shouldn't be a variable in our evaluating. I mean, if a crime has been committed and the elements are there and we think that there's a case, whether it's friend or foe, you follow the evidence.
Yeah, actually, one key element of the convention, and one where we butt heads very often with governments, is what we refer to as Article 5, which says that so for FCPA-like legislation, considerations of national economic interest or the relationships with another state should not influence the independence of investigations and prosecutions. So if we're on that same line of transnational bribery, it should apply as well. Now, obviously, there are practicalities. Indicting an official who's not there is one issue, but of course we know that where it hurts is confiscation of assets. So there will be other, and so I think in the same way that there are a lot of us from different countries around these tables or around all of these tables, and different parts of society, different parts of the world, the way it's going to be efficient is if we bind together and we push this forward. It's not going to be, and I think when your colleague was coming to speak last week to the working group on bribery, it's also what he said, it's another deterrence. The idea is that we continue to work together and we try to make it more and more difficult from the different sides of the equation. It's not going to make corruption disappear tomorrow or next year, but it is about pushing forward. And it is still about both sides of the equation. And I know we're talking about FIPA here, but bear in mind that still about half of the countries that are parties to the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention that have legislation on foreign bribery have still not enforced it, and for some of them they've enforced it at such low levels that it's really insignificant. So we really have to keep the pressure on both sides and keep engaging with the private sector and civil society. This morning there was a session on ill-gotten gains, and there was the French prosecutor, the French deputy head of the French serious fraud office, if you will, and as well as somebody from TI France, and they were saying how they cooperate to also seize ill-gotten gains from that are in France. So it's going to be about participation of different bits of society and about participation of the different actors in the countries. And of course, it's going to be easier if the law enforcement can talk to each other and can help each other. But sometimes the help might come from the civil society and not the other law enforcement authorities.
Amanda, I really want your answer on this. I want to know how you think about this. So what Alex and Rafsanjani are talking about, that situation, how does this work in the global Magnitsky setting? If there is clear evidence that a qualifying corrupt act took place and your organization helps present that to the U.S. government, take us from there. What's actually in that black box?
Yeah.
And how does it differ now that it's going to be criminal law involved here and not an elective sanctions program?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's, as Scott and others have been saying, the global Magnitsky sanctions, one of the, it's an extremely powerful tool, but I think one of the frustration points that civil society folks have with it is a discretionary tool. And you can present the most legally solid case. You can show all the evidence of all the transactions and the bribes paid and where the money went. And the U.S. government or any other government with similar Magnitsky-style laws, they don't have to do a thing about it if they don't want to. It is a tool of foreign policy. And so, that's, I think, additionally one of the benefits of having these, stronger, more flexible laws on the books is that it starts to open up a space where discretion is maybe taken out of it in some ways for this type of accountability measure. But I think, again, I still we've seen a lot of really powerful examples of these tools being used, even in cases where the actors were within countries that are nominally U.S. security partners or where the U.S. government otherwise has close ties. So I don't want to leave people with the false impression that, if it's a country or a government that the U.S. is friendly with, it's an absolutely no-go area. But it takes a little bit more convincing and persuading to the U.S. government, to the State Department, Treasury Department, other stakeholders that are involved, that it's something that's worthwhile, and there's potentially really powerful objectives and outcomes, ways that they could leverage the bilateral relationship and leverage the sanctions to achieve something that would be extremely beneficial for them and hopefully for the situation itself. But again, I think there's a really interesting and potentially promising area of overlap between how sanctions can be used and these types of tools. One of the things that I didn't quite touch on earlier too, but there's with the Biden administration, I think there's an increasing interest in looking at the enablers of corruption. And I know that's been a huge topic of many of the panels in this conference, and looking at how we can use sanctions tools to target enablers of corruption. And I think sanctions in those spaces too could potentially be very helpful for a law enforcement setting. Especially if part of the objective of the sanctions is to encourage their cooperation with law enforcement investigations. That could be a kind of thing where we start to see sanctions being used to squeeze the primary actors and to get the really core information that might be needed to take things to the next level.
And we're not starting from scratch, right? I mean, the FCPA unit at the DOJ, presumably in a lot of those cases where they're providing evidence and bringing cases that an American company or a company listed on a U.S. stock exchange offered or gave a bribe, the flip side of that is that the official perhaps accepted the bribe, right? So we're not...
So I think that's what I was going to say. I sort of also look at the FCPA as sort of a bit of a guideline here too. And as you were speaking, I was thinking to myself, Volkswagen and Daimler Chrysler, right, might disagree, right? There's a huge FCPA violation, and that Volkswagen and officials from these organizations, right, which are, in theory, Germany is a strong partner of the U.S. There was that litigation went on for years, and it was followed not just by the U.S. government, but by all sorts of EPAs for state governments for some of the violations as well. So I look at the FCPA as maybe that could be a bit of a more of the pattern we'll follow. But I think at the end of the day, we won't know until we actually get the first initial sort of guidance and when we see those first cases being prosecuted. So I agree with you. We don't know what the pathway is yet. We don't know what in theory, someone paid a bribe. That's the FIPA violation, right? But we don't know what it looks like. We don't know the contours of it. And I think that the next year will be filled with figuring out exactly what that looks like.
Great transition. So we've got about 5 minutes till we open it up for Q&A. But FIPA was passed last December. The Biden administration said in their countering corruption strategy that it supported criminalizing the demand side of bribery. We know that the DOJ was supportive of FIPA. We know that the DOJ has said that FIPA will qualify for their whistleblower rewards program for those who blow the whistle on FIPA violations that's reported. If you were, on behalf of your various constituencies and stakeholder perspectives here, talking to the DOJ, and you said, this is what I need to make sure that we can make FIPA as effective as possible. From your perspective, what do you need to hear from the DOJ now as they think about implementing and providing guidance on FIPA?
I can
go for it, Alex.
Offer a couple things. I mean, I think picking up a little bit on some of what Amanda has said is needing to think of these new tools as not existing in a vacuum, but needing kind of a supporting ecosystem around them and as being part of a pipeline. And I think a lot of investigative journalism has produced evidence that fed into successful FCPA cases, successful global Magnitsky sanctions. And so that's an important kind of, where are these leads going to come from? Whistleblowers, which you mentioned, great source, but investigative journalism is another one. And so continuing financial support for investigative journalism, but also as part of the U.S. and other countries' wider support. Can investigative journalists do their job safely in these countries and continuing to support their work through other means? And then there need to be these connection, these ways of connecting the work of journalism with other stakeholders. And our experience at the Global Anti-Corruption Consortium, where we partner with Transparency International, is that some of that happens automatically. The story's published online. You and your colleagues might find it and read it. But in other instances, there's a lot more impact if that handoff is done actively. And so we work with a team of lawyers at TI who will take stories that reporters worked on, add additional evidence, add legal analysis, and then make that information available to the authorities on both criminal issues as well as sanction issues. And I think this creates a great new opportunity to do that, and speaks to the way that, only if the ecosystem improves is this tool also going to be able to be effective.
And so what do you think that program, the Global Anti-Corruption Consortium, or GAC, what do you think those folks doing that good work would need to see from the DOJ in order to be able to help put together those submissions?
Well, the dialogue is what's helpful, and it's not with the journalists, it's with the civil society lawyers that we work with, kind of understanding what types of evidence they need, what are the enforcement priorities. None of us have time to waste, and so if we understand where the appetite is, and those exchanges, I think, increasingly are happening across stakeholders. I've seen it just this week that we all work in our silos to some degree, but there is a lot more creative thinking than there was 10 years ago about we need to help each other, even if we're doing very different lines of work.
Other thoughts on what's needed? Michelle, I'm curious, from the private sector. Yeah, folks on the ground.
I think that we'll need to see, I'm thinking DOJ, but I'm also thinking sort of what needs to happen in the private sector, right? Which needs to be this sort of normalization from top to bottom across value chains. Everyone has to understand what this means, and everyone has to sort of buy into it. I think it's a very similar thing of what you were speaking of, is sort of having dialogues and conversations with enforcement, with DOJ. What are going to be the enforcement priorities? What are the things that are not so are high priority, or what's happening here, so that the private sector can really understand what its obligations are in terms of having integrity around this issue. I think also, again, using FCPA in my brain and what's happened there. And so what does effective FIPA sort of risk prevention look like, risk mitigation look like? What will be the contours of that? Is it, if I do one thing, things 1 and 2, is that enough, or do I have to do 10 things? And it could depend on the size and the scale of your business. So I think the private sector will really want to know this. I know that one of our teams did a session in Jakarta, and we wanted to tell folks about, FIPA while we were there, and the room was packed a bit like this with people from the private sector who wanted to know what does this mean. And so I think the private sector, wants to behave, and so we have to be sure also that we give those guidelines.
Steve, please.
And I think another element that's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. A big part of FCPA enforcement is that there are, incentives for companies that fall under FCPA to, self-report sometimes when there are situations that they identify. There's incentives for them to cooperate in terms of, ultimately what the fines and penalties will be. And it's going to be just an interesting new wrinkle now with, now not only are they coming forward and providing information regarding a case about themselves, but there's this new FIPA element to think about, and potentially cooperating and providing information on the public officials. Certainly that was always an element there, and there was potential for engagement in those cases, again, with enforcement in whatever country that was. But it's just going to be kind of, as this is established and starts to be rolled out, how that plays out when it comes into companies factoring in, like, what are going to be the expectations on them once they, cooperate or self-report?
You're at the FBI's International Corruption Unit. What is, to the extent you could say, what's needed if somebody comes to you, if somebody walked up to you at the conference and said, I have information and evidence about a bribe solicitation from a foreign official that is under the jurisdiction of FIPA? Are you waiting for DOJ writ large to provide guidance?
To be honest with you right now, and again, it's new, and that has happened, but really just under FCPA, really. And so at this point, my evaluation of the elements that are brought to me would be, really the same. It's like I would then approach DOJ fraud section that works and say, here's what we've got. And, theoretically, if you have the elements for an FCPA case, you should have the elements for a FIPA case. Now, whether you're going to get, again, the cooperation and everything that you need carry the FIPA case through to its conclusion, we'll see. But they seem to go hand in hand in my mind.
And then before we open it up for Q&A, so folks be thinking about questions, please. We have a mic that'll go around. But from civil society, Rafsanjani, Amanda, what do y'all need to hear about next steps for FIPA so y'all can hit the ground running on this?
Thank you very much. I think, like she rightly pointed out, first and foremost, I think we're lucky we have a commitment from the United States government in the fight against corruption, which was a departure from what it used to be. So at least we have drawn that fundamental principle of commitment to the fight against corruption, and therefore the government can do everything possible to ensure that legal framework are just not there for decoration, but for them to be applied and imposed. So once we got that commitment from the government, and we also got the necessary support that are needed based on evidence, I think it will really go a long way. And then again, civil society need to continuously engage, and the media, because this work more of like civil society and the media. The more civil society and the media continue to raise these issues, the more even the judiciary, they will be compelled to do the needful. But if there's a silence from the civil society, from the media, it will be extremely difficult. I'll give you an example. The PNID, one of the major global scandal in Nigeria, if not because of the work that we've done at the level of civil society organization, that monumental scandal and fraud would have gone, and the Nigerian government would have paid a huge amount of millions of dollars for any purpose other than intended to defraud the country. So I think the voices of civil society and the media with the investigative journalism to ensure that whatever case they are pushing, case that are really with the credible data and evidence, will go a long way to get these judges and the government to really have the to do the needful to ensure that the law is just not just there, but also to be used for improvement of system. Thank you.
Yeah.
And
just to add on to that, I think one of the greatest concerns we come across in the global Magnitsky space when working with civil society and talking with them about starting to share information with various governments is the security concerns. It's going to be obviously very different country to country, context to context, but I think there's a really high level of concern and fear that many groups face about what's going to happen with the information they share. Is it possibly ever going to be traced back to them? Is the information they share potentially one day maybe going to have to be turned over to an individual that they recommended for sanctions who was in fact sanctioned? And so I think doing a lot of as part of the outreach or dialogues with civil society, helping explain that risk assessment piece of it to them and ensuring they have a good understanding of what protections are or are not in place, and as much as possible for the U.S. government to be thinking through what kind of maybe perhaps additional protections can we be offering these individuals, especially if they are coming forward in countries where their lives, their well-being may be in much more acute jeopardy if their identities become known, and what sort of additional protections or steps could the U.S. government be taking to assist them in those situations? Such
a good point. And France, if I could, as the OECD looks at the United States implementing this kind of law, how will that resonate with the OECD's own work and development of demand-side bribery policy? How does that dovetail into the work that y'all are doing?
So it certainly dovetails because, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we now have this section on addressing the demand side, and so in that respect, it falls very squarely into it. But obviously, because we're at the OECD, what we look at is how things are going to work globally. So in our view, the way this is going to work is if globally these standards develop, they might not be all in the same way as FIPA, but in one ways or another. So it'll be about enhanced international cooperation. It'll be about enhanced cooperation in countries, not necessarily authority to authority, but also with the different stakeholders. And it'll be about something that's in the recommendation, which we didn't mention, but also that might be of interest also to CIPA, is the collective action initiatives. Also supporting that will be part of addressing the demand side, also part of supporting notably SMEs that may be confronted with a bribery. So it's, in our view, it's part of a broader policy approach to addressing demand side, one of which is the arm of the law and its enforcement. But it cannot be only that, especially because there are practical issues as well with reaching FIPA. But it's about all of the stakeholders here coming together and bringing their bits. And as one of my colleagues says, with your food basket and my food basket, the people will thrive. So that's the idea, I think, that we'll be looking at.
Well, we want to hear from your basket. So who has questions in the audience for us? I saw your hand first. Right here. We got a mic right behind you. Just tell us your name and your affiliation if you have.
Sure, yeah, my name's James Bolton-Jones and I'm from the UK-based NGO Spotlight on Corruption. I thought it might be useful for the discussion to mention the UK's recent first actually ever successful use of the demand side bribery mechanism in the UK Bribery Act for a conviction that was literally just happened 3 months ago for the former Chief of Staff of the Madagascan President. And the interesting way in which that conviction was secured was through a covert operative going to take a wire to record the conversation between this Chief of Staff, former Chief of Staff, sort of soliciting the bribe after a tip-off from the company that was being asked to make it. So with that in mind, my question is, and it's kind of already been touched on, but if panelists could expand a bit on how we can secure those kind of parallel, simultaneous convictions of both the bribe taker and the bribe giver, maybe under FIPA, whereas in this case that kind of wasn't really possible because of the need for the covert evidence, which only came about because of the company kind of referring the law enforcement agency to what was going on. Thanks.
So how to make sure these are done in tandem, and I would say importantly to make sure that enforcement of FIPA doesn't take away from the robust continued enforcement of the FCPA.
I mean, I'll just say that, you know, it will be interesting because for us, most of the FCPA cases are usually more historical in nature. We don't have too many that are sort of being investigated as they're ongoing. So, you know, potentially it'll be the kind of thing where that might open up, you know, through FIPA, some opportunities to do more proactive FCPA investigations. But yeah, for right now, and of course that's going to be interesting too, because I'm not really sure how that would work if you had a bribery activity that took place prior to the passing of FIPA. If any of those, I mean, I'm guessing it would only be acts that take place after December. Nope.
Other thoughts from the panel?
So I was thinking a little bit that it's going to be complex because technically if you have an FCPA violation, right, you have FIPA, and who, like, it's egg before the chicken. So if you cooperate in your FCPA violation by telling on the government official who asked for it, what does that mean for you as a company, right? I think that's why we're going to need the next year or maybe 2 years to see really what happens in that space, because it's sort of, I don't know, when you're kids and, you know, you're like tattling on the other person who, like, you socked your sibling, but what did they do first, right? So I think we're going to see lots and lots of complication in that way, and I wish I had a solid prediction on what I thought that was going to look like. I really don't, and I think the courts and DOJ prosecutions can surprise us, so I'm going to just be watching closely and tracking to see what happens.
France.
Very quickly, but just to say, because looking beyond just FIPA, but also other legislations like the UK or others, I think where the intergovernmental organizations can help or push is so that there's spontaneous sharing of information between the authorities. So that the figure that I cited about how this flip side cases were detected, so that at least that changes, so that among the countries that are party to the convention that meet twice a year and closed doors, the law enforcement officials, at least on that front, that should be the first area we could make concrete progress. So that if there's a transnational corruption case where the foreign public official is in one of the country's party, then there's effective exchange of information and working together, which frankly, among those countries parties to the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, which is beyond the OECD, there should be possibilities to work together. There should be stronger and more independent law enforcement that have the capacity to do it. So I think that's a place where we can very operationally start, for sure.
Well said. Okay, what other hands did I see? Let's go here and then here.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Evgen Tokar. I'm from Ukraine, National Anti-Corruption Bureau. FBI is our trusted partner, so my question will be, first of all, for my colleague Steven. Now Ukraine is working on improvement of our tools about foreign bribery and to fit the recommendations of OECD. Yeah. And we are very interested in your experience. So my question is, what are the main challenges in investigation of such crimes and how do you address them? We would like to consider your experience. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, kind of as I mentioned earlier, the biggest challenge, I mean, it was already the biggest challenge in the FCPA cases, and I think it's going to be the same in FIPA, and that is, by definition, it's going to involve evidence that occurs in a foreign jurisdiction. So the biggest challenge is going to be, depending on that jurisdiction, getting the cooperation and the evidence you need in a way that's usable in court in the United States. So that's the number one challenge. And then secondly, I would just kind of, going back to the last question, would say, and certainly for FIPA, given that it's a fairly new law, and so it's going to, at least for now, concern recent activity, is finding out information in a timely manner in a way that you can investigate proactively. I think those are the two.
Okay. How about right here?
Hi, my name is Richard Bistrong, and Scott, thank you. I mean, your focus on the practicalities of this, it's a great panel. But Steve, as you shared, like with the FCPA, there's some U.S. nexus, right? There's a server, there's evidence, there's some dependence on, international cooperation and MLATs. But here, much more of the epicenter of evidence is going to be located overseas. Mm-hmm. So maybe, I don't know that it's an answerable question, and maybe it's an elephant in the room question, but at some point you need to get this person back to the United States to face criminal charges, and the extradition process is not without a very strong political component, where countries, even if they're satisfied that the evidence is there, the judicial process does not favor extradition. So are there any thoughts? I mean, there's some great words here, pathways, pipelines, ecosystems to try to squeeze an individual, but still getting that individual out of their home country is so politically charged. So I was just wondering if there are any thoughts from this wonderful multi-perspective panel on how you get someone to face justice.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly agree with everything that you said. I mean, as I've kind of been repeating a few times here, like that overseas component is certainly the biggest challenge. And you're right, too. Even though we get a conviction in the United States, that does not necessarily mean that we're going to get our hands on, the individual. But, in some sense, it's almost like sanctions plus, right? Like we can put out a red notice that limits that person's ability to travel. Certainly sanctions have an impact on the individual's ability to engage in commerce and so forth, but with a criminal conviction, it might open up new avenues for, asset forfeiture, because I think there is some misconceptions on what we can and can't do under the sanctions in terms of assets, but with a conviction, that might open up some new angles. So certainly not a perfect world, and we're going to have some obstacles, but I think if we can obtain convictions, that does give us some new ability to take action, to make somebody's life difficult, even if we can't put them in prison.
Ross and Johnny, we're jumping in.
So actually, for me, I don't think it is, it might be difficult, but I think it is also all about the determination to ensure that there's justice. First, United States, has relationship with many countries, and they can, ensure that the legal mutual assistance is imposed. there is what many of the countries are having with the United States, bio-commission. And these are issues that they can actually discuss with them and agree with them that in case if there's any issue like that, extradition should not be an issue. If we are able to do that, then we will be able to deal with all these things. But I think fundamentally on the sanction, it was, in the case of Nigeria, it was before that many politically exposed persons, they want to come to America. No big man want to come to the U.S. because in the U.S., they monitor how they spend money, they monitor all this. So they don't come to the U.S. The U.S. is no longer a country where the thieves, the corrupt persons want to come. So if you cancel their visa, then give them visa. They are not interested to come. But then you need to work with other countries like UK, like Dubai, where they usually go and enjoy and do whatever they like there. Unless there's that strategic relationship or partnership between the United States government and countries like Dubai, Saudi, United Kingdom, France, Germany, these are countries that Nigerian, politically exposed and corrupt person used to go. So if they stop them from going to those countries, they will feel it. But stopping them from coming to the US, they don't even come. So the sanction is only affecting those that did not actually matter. So there's need for the United States to also reprioritize its own, categorization of sanction. Visa ban is not working, because they don't even want to come there. Assets that they have, corruptly, bought in the US is another way you can actually take that asset, Now, if you take that asset, who is going to be the beneficiary? Is it the victims of the corruption or the United States government? So again, we have to, see how we can deal with that and transferring this asset as not being usable because it is the same government that will loot that recovered asset. They will loot it. So you need to work directly with the people. And I think under responsibility to protect, the United States can actually begin to do that. If you discover there's a stolen asset belonging to the country, rather than giving it to the Nigerian government, give it to the people. Work with the non-state actors who work with the victims of corruption so that they actually benefit, rather than giving it to another set of looters who are going to loot the scene again, like what we are seeing now was assets recovery.
Yeah, there was an op-ed put out by a supporter of FIFA who joked that the Orlando jail could be used for kleptocrats because of all the folks who wanted to bring their kids to Disney World. And so when they touch down in the United States, that's an opportunity to get them. But obviously in practice, we're going to need a much more collaboration. France, I saw you. Go ahead.
Yeah, very quickly, there's Euro Disney and there's one in Japan as well, so maybe that works too. But I completely agree. I don't think extradition will work, frankly. But first of all, you did sanction and convict an Ecuadorian president who happened to be in Miami, I believe, under money laundering. So there is still sometimes they are sometimes around. So that might still be a possibility when they are, and if they are.
Sometimes
otherwise,
timing is everything.
Absolutely, absolutely. Time it with spring break or something. I don't know. But yes, you need to take their money. And for that international cooperation, where you've got a conviction, where assets have been identified, you might be able to get international cooperation with the UK, with France, with Germany, with Switzerland, or wherever they might have their assets. But beyond that, there probably is also a softer deterrent effect that if you have a foreign official that's named as convicted, even if you don't have him or her personally, that means that companies that are engaging with this country and with this public official will have to do greater due diligence. So it's kind of a black mark already on the country. It also means lower investor confidence in terms of foreign direct investment or exports. So even although obviously that's less measurable or quantifiable, that may also have an effect, I think, the fact that you're convicting someone.
Go ahead, Michelle. Yeah.
And so I think maybe to build off of that a little bit, right, in theory, the DOJ will be telling us who, the foreign officials or maybe what regions or where they're from. That's information that can be useful. Again, I think the private sector will want to avoid those companies and will want to avoid those countries, which is complex in its own way, but it could have an impact that the fact that we're going to have more information, and how does that information get used by both the private sector, by CSOs, how do they come together and collaborate and use that? I think it could be an interesting leverage point to maybe make change. So maybe not extraditing folks, but making their lives very uncomfortable, maybe even where they actually live.
Right, and again, we're not starting from scratch. I mean, I think that the global Magnitsky sanction is a close approximation, let alone a criminal indictment from the U.S. government. I mean, you just briefly, Amanda, what are some of the consequences of a global Magnitsky sanction, let alone a formal criminal indictment that folks could look at?
I mean, it's a huge black mark, I think, for individuals around the world. We've heard that, obviously individuals who are sanctioned have the ability to challenge their designation, and for folks that are sanctioned for corruption under global Magnitsky, there's pretty much 100% challenge rate, which tells you right there that, even if they are publicly saying like, I'm not planning to go to Disney World anytime soon, like I don't need the U.S., like it's still a black mark on them, and it's still something that they have to re-navigate their lives around. Even banks that, the sanctions just obligate U.S. banks, U.S. companies, U.S. persons not to engage in financial transactions with that individual. But I think a lot of other foreign banks also look at what the U.S. is doing and will also bring heightened levels of due diligence or maybe decide not to engage in business with this individual because of the risks it starts to expose them to. We haven't seen this so much in the global Magnitsky space yet, but we have in other sanctions programs where the U.S. government has been much more forward-leaning than some other jurisdictions when it comes to secondary sanctions. So sanctioning totally foreign contact or transactions with a sanctioned individual. And so I think people start to look at individuals or companies, entities that are sanctioned as proceed with caution, because it starts to get the potential for further eyes on that individual, limitations that individual is going to be facing for their own engagements with action. So I think it's I would imagine this type of action would have very similar consequences, but even just the sanctions alone, there's a huge stigma around it.
Okay, a few minutes left. Questions?
Hi, my name is Felipe Santos. I work at the World Bank, but I'm asking this in my personal capacity. So just building on that question as well, I just wanted to see if you could clarify a little bit more the basis for jurisdiction, because to me it's still not entirely clear. So unlike, if I understand correctly, unlike the FCPA, you don't need any type of territorial nexus with the U.S. So that means, for example, if I'm from Brazil, if I'm a Brazilian company that's listed in the U.S., I can come to the DOJ to report a solicitation by a Brazilian public official or an official from a third jurisdiction. Thank you.
Oh, the legal weeds question. So unless anybody else wants to... Okay, definitely don't want to touch that. Fun. So basically, it uses the same language as the FCPA. So if bribe demand is made through an instrumentality of interstate or foreign commerce, so a text message, an email, but there has to be a nexus, and the nexus is that it's a U.S. person, a U.S. company, a company listed on a U.S. stock exchange through the same theory as the FCPA, or in the territory of the United States. Those are the four ways that the U.S. government can have jurisdiction over it. And there's an express statement of that in the law that Congress has provided extraterritorial jurisdiction so that we know it will be as defensible as possible should it be challenged in court. But a very good question. Folks, we have 4 minutes left. Are there any questions? Yeah. Right here.
So.
Oh, I'm sorry. Please.
Good afternoon. I'm Mariam Karajabi, Principal Anti-Corruption Expert of the African Development Bank. And I think as we are exploring new tools to fight foreign bribery, and what's happened sometimes is the asset recovery side. I have heard a lot of discussion going on during all of this conference, how to return the asset, how to do it, and to avoid also that the asset will be again used illegally. I think we can explore some. I heard a lot of. We have to give back to the population or to give to NGO working with the population. But what I noticed by working in these African countries is also the stakeholder of the people that are fighting corruption or fighting economic crime are I think, lacking of resources. So this kind of resource could be used to build a capacity in order to prevent this asset to be, I think, illegally used by the corrupted leaders. So I think also we need to build a capacity, and why not? And thinking about putting some conditionality. I heard that there are also someone from World Bank here. Sometimes when we are giving this loan to the country, we put conditionalities, saying that, okay, before giving this loan, maybe you need to adopt public reform. You need to have this stronger legal framework addressing, I don't know, corruption, addressing economic crime in general. And putting this as condition of restitution could be also an idea in order to have a strong legal framework, strong institutional framework as well, and also building capacity of those stakeholders that are on the first line of this kind of issues. Thank you.
Thank you. What do folks think? Tying that in maybe even expressly for demand-side bribery prosecutions, perhaps, in those agreements. Anybody want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say that, yes, I totally agree with her that we need to build the capacity of different stakeholders, including the judges themselves, because sometimes you'll be surprised, many of the judges are outdated, and they need to, validate or update their knowledge and capacity to be able to come to terms with the, reality. Secondly, the civil society and the media, they need to also build their capacity to be able to do quality advocacy that will lead to reduction in the corruption, and the issues around judicial corruption generally. I think there's need to invest in the capacity enhancement of the different stakeholders to be able to succeed in this pursuit. I think I totally agree.
We have time for one more question. If you want to just speak up, I think we could all hear you. Maybe wait for the mic if you would. Got ahead of ourselves.
Thank you very much. I was thinking about the contingency plan, particularly for the Global Magnitsky Act, because we have heard about recent attempts and maybe some successful attempts to certain oligarchs to be removed from the list of the Global Magnitsky. And certainly in Bulgaria, where I live, there is a tendency, and because this is a political instrument, to change the policy of the US through different mechanisms on the ground. And I think this will be very discouraging if there is a removal from the Magnitskys after so many efforts from the civil society. And maybe FEPA is a part of this contingency plan or whistleblowing program. So maybe not so common, but I think that maybe you can elaborate a little bit on such type of contingencies in this regard.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to kick us off there. Yeah, I think the Global Magnitsky Sanctions Program has been in existence since 2017. We've seen really robust usage of the program and a few handful of delistings to date, but I think there's been a lot of reporting in the media around concerns about potential delisting of Dan Gertler or easing of sanctions against Dan Gertler and other situations where we know individuals who have been sanctioned for corruption are looking for the playbook to get delisted. I think that's a huge concern for us as civil society advocates and, frankly, for the folks that work on these programs, because these are tools of accountability. And, I think it's our view that nobody should be delisted from this program absent some behavior change, accountability process that would account for what they did and what they were sanctioned for. I think one of the key things for civil society groups to be aware of is if you are looking at a situation in your country or that you're tracking and following of someone, of an entity that has been sanctioned and there are concerns about delisting out there, I think one of the most effective things to do is to continue to provide information to the U.S. government about any ongoing abuses that individual is involved in, because if that individual is trying to make the case that I'm no longer engaged in corruption or I have cleaned my hands of this situation, but you're sitting on information that they haven't, that's really helpful for the U.S. or frankly I'm sure any of these other governments to know. We're in a space right now where we're trying to continue to push the U.S. government that if there are going to be delistings under this program, there needs to be demonstrated accountability. And absent that, it looks like the anti-corruption sanctions tool is perhaps being corrupted in some ways, which is not in the interest, I think, of anybody. At least not anybody interested in anti-corruption. And so my encouragement to groups out there, and would be happy to chat further after this event for folks that need it or would like an additional steer. But if you have information, send it in because that's, I think, the most helpful way to try to fight back against delistings.
All right, folks, this is what the Alliance Against Demand-Side Bribery looks like. So I want to thank my panelists, each and every one of you, for taking time today. And thank you for our audience. Appreciate y'all's involvement. Have a great rest of the conference. Thank you.